I'm a retired FBI agent, and I'm here today to talk about the Tupac Shakur murder and the investigation that followed.
The FBI kept a file on Tupac, and deep inside was one page they tried to destroy. Now, it's finally public, and what it reveals is darker than anyone expected. This wasn't about his music or his crimes. What pattern did Tupac recognize that scared them so badly? Join us as we decode the page that was never meant to see daylight. The page that refused to die. Something strange happened in a basement office in Washington, D.C. on a Tuesday morning. A young archivist named Sarah Chen was alone in a room full of metal cabinets that stretched from floor to ceiling, like silent soldiers guarding stories. Nobody was supposed to remember. She had been working there for 3 years and had learned that most files were boring, just old paperwork about things that didn't matter anymore. But on this particular morning, her fingers stopped on a folder that felt different somehow. Heavier maybe, or just wrong, in a way she couldn't explain. The label said, Case File 7849-96. And beneath it in smaller letters was a name that made her breath catch. Tupac Shakur. She pulled the folder carefully like it might break or scream, and inside was mostly what she expected. Surveillance reports and interview transcripts and concert schedules marked with red pen. But at the very back, pressed flat against the cardboard, was a single page that didn't belong with the others. This page had been scheduled for destruction 4 different times according to the stamps in the corner. Once in 1998, again in 2003, then 2009, and finally 2015. But each time someone had written a small notation in pencil that simply said, hold, not destroyed or postponed or under review. Just hold, as if the page itself was waiting for the right moment to breathe again. Sarah read the page 3 times, and each time she felt more confused because it didn't accuse Tupac of anything. It didn't mention crimes or threats or even specific concerns. Instead, it described him watching, learning, asking questions about things that connected in ways the writer seemed worried about. The last line was the strangest part. It said, subject demonstrates pattern recognition regarding institutional response protocols. Sarah didn't understand what that meant, but she understood the feeling beneath the words. Someone had been afraid not of what Tupac was doing, but of what he was figuring out. Not afraid of his anger or his music or his influence, but afraid of his understanding, afraid that he could see the shape of something that was supposed to stay invisible. And whoever wrote this page had documented that fear carefully, precisely, like they were leaving evidence for someone who would need it later, someone who would recognize the same pattern in someone else. Tupac. Under the spotlight, Tupac under watch. Tupac Shakur was 23 years old when he became more than just a rapper, more than just an artist, more than just a voice on the radio that made people feel something real and raw and true. He was becoming a mirror that reflected back everything broken in America, and people loved him for it, while others feared him for the exact same reason. His concerts filled stadiums where thousands of voices screamed his lyrics back at him, like prayers or battle cries. Young black men saw themselves in his anger and his pain. Young women heard him speak about his mother and felt seen in ways the world usually ignored. White kids in suburbs bought his albums and felt the weight of truths their parents never mentioned. But while crowds gathered and cameras flashed and magazines put his face on their covers, something else was happening in rooms where no cameras were allowed. Federal agents were typing his name into reports with a frequency that seemed excessive for a musician. They were recording his interviews and analyzing his lyrics word by word, like archaeologists searching for hidden meanings in ancient texts. They were noting who he met with and what rallies he attended, and which political figures acknowledged him in public. The surveillance started small and routine, just basic monitoring of a public figure who spoke about police brutality and government corruption. But it grew quickly, spreading through departments like a virus nobody wanted to name. Agents who were assigned to watch Tupac began writing reports that felt less like security assessments and more like nervous observations from people who couldn't quite explain why they felt uneasy. One report from 1994 noted that subject displays unusual awareness of surveillance presence. Another from 1995 said, subject references systemic patterns in interviews suggesting comprehension beyond typical activist rhetoric. The language was cold and professional, but underneath it was something else. a kind of worry that didn't match the threat level of a 24-year-old making music. Because Tupac wasn't just angry, and he wasn't just loud. He was smart in a way that made people uncomfortable. He was connecting historical dots and naming systems and asking his audience to see patterns they had been trained to ignore. He talked about COINTELPRO and the Black Panther Party, and how his own mother had been surveilled. He spoke about poverty in prison and pipelines like he understood they weren't separate problems but symptoms of the same design. And every time he did this in an interview or a song, someone somewhere was watching and taking notes and adding pages to a file that kept growing thicker, not because he was dangerous, but because he was teaching people to see. When observation turns into fear. The file on Tupac Shakur was supposed to be routine, but by 1995 it had become something nobody could quite categorize. It sat in a cabinet with files on actual organized crime figures and suspected terrorists, and people who had made explicit threats against federal buildings. But Tupac hadn't threatened anyone. He had just talked and performed and written words that made millions of people stop and think and feel. Yet his file was growing faster than almost any other active surveillance case in the Los Angeles field office. Agents were flagging his lyrics like they were coded messages, underlining phrases like "they organized a community" and "we was gonna make a move," and examining them under light that made poetry look like conspiracy. One particular report spent 6 pages analyzing the song Trapped, breaking down each verse like it was a blueprint for revolution instead of a young man's frustration with a system that had caged people who looked like him since before he was born. The strange part wasn't just that they were watching, it was how they were watching. With an intensity that suggested fear rather than caution, supervisors were requesting updates on Tupac's location and activities, with a frequency usually reserved for fugitives or imminent threats. His concert venues were surveilled, his hotel rooms were noted. People he ate dinner with were photographed and identified and added to their own growing files. When Tupac spoke at a rally about police violence, 3 different agencies filed reports about the same event. When he mentioned reading books by revolutionaries in an interview, someone highlighted the titles and cross-referenced them with other cases. The observation had shifted from monitoring a public figure to studying a problem they didn't know how to solve. Because Tupac was doing something that frightened a certain type of power, he was teaching people to see systems instead of isolated incidents, to recognize patterns instead of accepting chaos, to understand that their pain wasn't random, but designed. And he was doing it in a way that reached millions, in a language that couldn't be dismissed as academic or elite. He was translating complex political theory into beats and rhymes that 18-year-olds could memorize and repeat, making revolution accessible in a way that previous movements had struggled to achieve. And somewhere in the machinery of federal surveillance, people were noticing this, were measuring his influence, were calculating what it might mean if he continued growing. The reports began including phrases that revealed the shift: subjects' influence expanding beyond entertainment demographics, subjects' messaging reaching politically inactive populations, subject demonstrates capacity to mobilize youth sentiment. These weren't descriptions of a criminal, they were analyses of someone the system perceived as dangerous, not because of what he was doing, but because of what he was becoming: a catalyst, a teacher, a mirror that refused to look away. The page that breaks. The pattern. Deep inside the file, between pages of concert schedules and lyric analyses and surveillance photographs, was a document that didn't match anything around it. The other pages were typed on standard federal forms with checkboxes and category headers, and the bureaucratic language of institutional monitoring. But this page was different from the moment you saw it. The paper stock was heavier, and the formatting was irregular. No form number in the corner, no distribution list at the bottom, no signature line or approval stamps, just dense paragraphs of text that read less like a report and more like an assessment, like someone was thinking out loud on paper about something they couldn't quite name. The language was different too. Not the usual surveillance vocabulary of subjects and activities and known associates, but something more analytical, almost philosophical. It described Tupac not as a threat, but as a phenomenon, someone who had developed what the writer called an intuitive understanding of power structures and their defensive mechanisms. The page noted that he spoke about surveillance in interviews not with paranoia, but with precision, describing techniques and patterns that most citizens wouldn't recognize, referencing historical operations that the government had only recently acknowledged, COINTELPRO and Black Panther infiltration, and methods of disruption that were supposed to be classified or forgotten. The writer seemed disturbed not by what Tupac was saying, but by how he knew to say it, how he could identify the shape of institutional response before it fully materialized, how he predicted moves that hadn't been made yet, as if he had studied the playbook and memorized every page. There was a section about his music that felt odd, clinical. It analyzed how certain songs didn't just protest injustice, but mapped the systems that created it. How his lyrics connected economics to incarceration, to policy, to violence, in ways that created a complete picture, a comprehension that the page described as potentially destabilizing to public compliance. But the strangest part of the page was what it didn't say. There were sentences that ended abruptly. Thoughts that started but never finished, references to other documentation that didn't exist anywhere else in the file. At one point it mentioned comparable pattern recognition in previous subjects, but gave no names, no case numbers, no context. Just the suggestion that Tupac wasn't the first person to see too clearly and make others see with him, that this had happened before, that somewhere in the archives were other pages about other people who had committed the same crime of understanding, of teaching, of connecting, of making the invisible visible. The page felt less like evidence and more like a warning written to someone who would read it later. Someone who would understand what wasn't being explicitly stated. Someone who would recognize the pattern the writer was too careful to name directly. Symbols. In the margins, Sarah Chen had been staring at the page for 20 minutes when she noticed them. Small marks in the margins that she had initially dismissed as smudges or artifacts from photocopying, but they weren't random. They were deliberate, tiny symbols drawn in blue ink so faint they almost disappeared against the white paper. 3 of them down the right margin, each no bigger than a pencil eraser. The first looked like a circle with a line through it. The second resembled 2 triangles pointing at each other. The third was something between a star and a cross, geometric and precise, like a language she didn't know how to read. Sarah had seen markings on classified documents before, usually just initials or date stamps or routing codes. But these were different. They had no obvious meaning, no legend or key anywhere in the file to explain them, no reference guide or decoder that made them make sense. She pulled out her phone and photographed the page, zooming in until the symbols filled her screen. Then she did something she probably wasn't supposed to do. She searched the archive database for other documents with similar marginal notations, expecting to find nothing, hoping to find nothing. But the results made her hands start shaking. There were 17 other files across different departments and different decades that contained pages with identical symbols in the margins. One was a file on a journalist who had passed away in a car accident in 1977. Another was on a community organizer whose house had burned down in 1983. A third was on a musician Sarah had never heard of, who had disappeared in 1991. A fourth was on a professor who had been discredited and lost her position in 1999. None of these files were connected officially. They didn't reference each other, they weren't part of any acknowledged program or operation. But they all had pages with the same symbols, drawn in the same faint blue ink, in the same positions on the page, like someone had marked them with a code that only certain people would recognize. A silent classification system that existed beneath the official one. Sarah opened each file and found the marked pages and a pattern emerged that made her stomach hurt. Every single one of these pages described someone who had what the documents called advanced pattern recognition capabilities. People who could see systems and name them, who could explain to others how power worked and where it was vulnerable, who had audiences that listened and believed and started asking dangerous questions. The symbols appeared on pages that seemed to be assessments rather than accusations, evaluations of how much someone understood and how effectively they were sharing that understanding. None of the pages recommended arrest or prosecution. Instead, they used words like monitor and track and observe, as if these people weren't criminals, but specimens being studied, threats being measured, patterns being documented for future reference. A decision made too quietly. The meeting happened in a conference room with no windows on the 3rd floor of a building that most people walked past without noticing. There were 5 people present, and none of them introduced themselves with full names. They sat around a table with copies of the page in front of them, each copy stamped with red letters that said, "Review for disposal." The meeting lasted 18 minutes according to the clock on the wall, and nobody raised their voice once. The first person to speak was a woman in her 50s with gray hair pulled back tight, who said simply, "We all know why we're here." The page. Her tone was flat, matter of fact, like they had done this before. The second person was younger, maybe 40, wearing a suit that looked expensive. He said, "The file itself is scheduled for routine archival reduction, and this page is flagged as non-essential to historical record." It was a bureaucratic way of saying they wanted to make it disappear, wanted it gone, wanted it erased from memory and possibility. The third person was older, 60 at least, and he had the tired eyes of someone who had been in rooms like this before, who had made decisions like this before, who knew what happened when pages like this stayed in circulation. He said the markings alone make it problematic, and everyone at the table nodded like they understood exactly what he meant. Nobody asked what the markings were, nobody requested clarification, they all just knew. They had all seen the symbols before, had all understood what they signified, what they connected, what pattern they represented across decades and departments and cases that were never supposed to touch. The fourth person was a woman who hadn't looked up from the page since sitting down. She said, "Subject is deceased, so there's no active case concern. Disposal is standard protocol." Her voice was flat, procedural, like she was reading from a script she had memorized years ago. Like she had said these exact words about other pages, other people, other patterns. The fifth person didn't speak at first, just listened, while the others went around agreeing with each other in language that said everything and nothing. Then finally he leaned forward and said, "Has anyone considered that destroying this creates more questions than keeping it?" His voice carried the slightest edge of concern. There was a pause, brief and uncomfortable. The first woman said, "We're not destroying anything. We're following retention guidelines." But everyone in the room knew that was a lie, knew that this page was being targeted specifically, that someone had flagged it, not because it was irrelevant, but because it was too relevant. The younger man in the expensive suit made a note on his copy of the page and said, "I'll authorize the disposal. We'll keep this simple and clean." But as he said it, something happened that nobody acknowledged out loud. Each person at the table glanced at the others. Or the erasure that failed. The page was supposed to disappear on a Thursday in March of 2016 at exactly 3 p.m. when a contracted document disposal service would arrive to collect boxes of declassified materials marked for destruction. Sarah found the work order later, and the language was so casual it almost seemed innocent. Routine archival reduction batch 7-4. B. Nothing in those words suggested what was actually being erased. The page about Tupac was placed in a manila folder with 43 other documents that someone had decided the world didn't need to see anymore. Sealed in a box, labeled with a destruction date, and moved to a staging area in the basement where it would wait for the shredding truck. But something happened that day that nobody could quite explain later when people started asking questions. The disposal service called that morning to say their truck had broken down and they would need to reschedule for the following week. A small delay, barely worth noting. The kind of thing that happens in any bureaucracy, except when the truck finally arrived the following Thursday, the box with the Tupac page wasn't in the staging area anymore. Someone had moved it back to active storage with a small yellow note attached that said, "Pending secondary review." No signature on the note, no date, no indication of who had requested the review or why. The disposal technician marked it as incomplete on his paperwork and moved on to the other boxes, and the page stayed exactly where it was. Administrators tried to figure out who had written the yellow note. They checked logs and schedules and email records, but nobody claimed responsibility. Nobody remembered seeing it. Nobody could explain how a document marked for destruction had suddenly become pending review without any official documentation of that decision. It should have been impossible. There were protocols and signatures and chains of custody specifically designed to prevent this kind of confusion. Yet it had happened smoothly, quietly, like someone who understood the system had moved through it without leaving footprints, and the page remained filed away, still marked for eventual disposal, but now delayed indefinitely, waiting in a cabinet between other forgotten documents, its symbols still faint in the margins, its words still describing a young man who had seen too clearly. And somewhere, someone knew it was still there, knew exactly where it was, knew that it hadn't been destroyed, as if the page itself had a schedule that humans could interrupt, but not cancel. Time moves on, the page does not. Tupac Shakur passed away in September of 1996, and the world mourned and moved forward the way the world always does. His music kept playing and new artists emerged, and the 90s became the 2000s and then the 2010s. People who had loved him got older and had children, and those children discovered his songs and felt the same electricity their parents had felt. But in a basement archive in Washington, D.C., the page stayed frozen in time. Sarah traced its history through digital records and found something that made her pause. The file number for Tupac's case had been updated 6 times since his death. Not the content, just the file number, reassigned to different classification categories, moved between departments, renamed and recoded, like it was being kept active even though the subject was gone. In 2003, it was transferred from entertainment industry monitoring to historical political surveillance. In 2008, it moved again to domestic influence assessment. In 2014, it was briefly coded under pattern analysis before being moved back to archive status. These weren't normal archival movements. Files on deceased subjects usually just sat in storage, slowly being forgotten, gradually becoming historical curiosities. But Tupac's file was being touched, reviewed, maintained, like someone was checking on it periodically to make sure it was still there. Sarah found access logs that showed the file had been pulled for review in 2009, 2012, 2017, and 2021, each time by different people in different departments. Each time returned with no changes noted, no additions, no redactions, just viewed and refiled. She tried to find out who had requested these reviews, but the authorization codes led to offices that had been reorganized or supervisors who had retired or departments that no longer existed under those names. It was like watching a ghost moving through bureaucracy, leaving traces but no trail. And the page itself remained in the exact same position in the file, third from the back, beneath a concert schedule from 1995 and above a transcript of a radio interview, waiting, patient, preserved, as if someone somewhere knew that eventually it would be needed, that the patterns Tupac had recognized weren't finished, that the story wasn't over, that the page wasn't evidence of the past, but preparation for something still unfolding, the unsealing that feels like a signal. The page was released on a Monday in January with no press conference and no explanation. It appeared in a routine document dump of declassified materials posted on a government transparency website at 2 a.m. when most of America was sleeping, mixed in with thousands of other pages about forgotten investigations and closed cases. Sarah only found it because she had set up an alert for Tupac's name months earlier. She downloaded the file at 6 a.m. with coffee cooling beside her keyboard and felt her skin go cold. It was the same page she had seen in the archive. The page that had survived 4 destruction orders, the page with the symbols in the margins, but now it was public, anyone could see it. And yet, almost nobody was talking about it. She searched social media and found a handful of posts from Tupac fans sharing the document with confusion, trying to understand the bureaucratic language, asking what it meant. A few conspiracy theory accounts had picked it up, but their analysis seemed to miss the point entirely, focusing on surface details while ignoring the quiet horror underneath. Sarah waited for journalists to call, for news outlets to investigate, for someone to ask why this page existed and what the symbols meant, and why it had been scheduled for destruction so many times. But the coverage never came. Days passed, and the document just sat there in the digital archive, public but invisible, accessible but ignored, like it was waiting for someone specific to find it. Someone who would understand not just what it said, but what it represented. And Sarah realized that maybe that was the point. Maybe the page hadn't been released to inform the public, but to send a message to people who would recognize its significance. People who were doing now what Tupac had done then. People who were learning to see systems and teaching others to see them too. People who were asking dangerous questions and connecting dots that were supposed to stay separate. The page was a reminder that the system sees, that it watches, that it remembers. The unsealing wasn't transparency, it was a warning disguised as bureaucratic routine, and the timing felt deliberate. Released during a moment when new voices were rising, when new movements were organizing, when young people were once again learning to recognize patterns in how power protects itself. The truth that reframes everything. Sarah Chen found the archivist in a coffee shop 6 blocks from the building where they both used to work. He was 72 years old and had retired 3 years earlier after spending 46 years managing classified documents for agencies he still wouldn't name completely. She had tracked him down through retirement records and sent him a careful email that mentioned the page without explaining how much she knew. And he had agreed to meet with a weariness that suggested he had been expecting this conversation eventually. They sat by a window where winter light made everything look pale, and he stirred sugar into coffee he didn't drink, while Sarah asked him directly, why did this page survive when it was supposed to be destroyed? And he was quiet for a long time before he said, because it was never about Tupac. The words hung in the air between them like smoke. Sarah waited and he continued, his voice low and measured. The page was created as documentation of a pattern we've seen before. Someone gets big enough and smart enough and starts making people see things they're not supposed to see. We watch them, we file reports, and then something happens, or doesn't happen, and the person is gone. And years later, when someone new comes along doing the same thing, we pull the old files, we look at the patterns, we see what worked. And he stopped there, looking out the window at people passing by. Sarah felt sick. You're saying this page was kept as a reference. And the old man shook his head slowly. Not a reference, a warning, a template, proof that we've handled this before. He leaned back and finally looked at her directly. The symbols in the margins link it to other cases. Other people who saw too much, who taught too well, who made the system nervous. We don't destroy those pages because we might need to prove we were paying attention, and because sometimes people need to be reminded that we're still watching, Sarah asked. Who needs to be reminded? And he smiled sadly and said, whoever's standing where Tupac stood now, whoever's learning what he learned. The file is still active even though he's gone, because the pattern doesn't die with one person, it repeats. And we're still here, still watching, still taking notes, still drawing symbols and margins on pages we'll never fully destroy.